Okay. Hello. Um, hello. Sort of an impromptu video that a couple hours ago did not exist as an idea, but I had an experience this morning while reading a book that was completely new to me and really shook me up. And I ended up writing about it, trying to just parse through my thoughts. And the more I wrote, the more I thought about sharing it in sort of like a meta sense to see uh, what changes when you document an experience, I guess. That has just been a train of thought that I've been sort of working through recently. The sort of relationship between documenting slash recording, making something, and performance, especially just the idea of having an audience in mind. I feel like it sort of warps how sincere or authentic you can be, and just like aesthetic decisions in general. I don't know, something I've just been thinking about. Anyways, I was reading a book earlier this morning, and in the last 10 to 15 pages, there were these upside down annotations that just like filled in the margins, and they're dated like diary entries, and they just go on and on and on about some really harrowing stuff, to be honest. There's very little context given about who was writing this, like how old they were. They're just kind of like this ageless, faceless, genderless, characteristic-less person writing about a really turbulent home life and some domestic abuse that goes on. And reading it just really shook me up. I think partially because it was dated and kind of treated like diary entries, and the lack of context especially made it feel like it was written without like explaining anything to a potential reader. So it felt like I was reading something I wasn't supposed to, or like crossing a boundary by reading it. Yeah, I was just really moved by it, and spent a lot of time poring over every word, partially because the handwriting was pretty bad, so I had to like really try and study like what they were saying, and also because it just ends really abruptly. There's no context to begin with, but then the entries just suddenly stop, and it just made me reread all of it over again, as if somehow like if I don't know, it just gave it like a deeper significance. And yeah, I was just really shaken up, and I had like a very emotional response to reading it, and it made me think a lot about I'll just read what I wrote, basically, is the point. And I kind of want to see if I had like a sincere experience with it, but halfway through writing it, I started thinking about this as something that I could share, and was like, okay, well now, how do I contextualize this? And just having like a reader slash audience in mind was kind of the point of conflict that I'd started to write about. And so this on its own feels like an example, the same way that reading these sort of like private diary entries felt to me like an example of the same sort of conflict I've had with like documenting and performing, where I read something that was obviously made without an audience in mind, and was really affected by it. So yeah, I'm gonna read this and see if somehow, I don't know, I'm just gonna read it, I guess. Okay, so while reading the last 50 pages of this book, I found pages of annotations that had nothing to do with them, the book that is, pages of dated diary entries that were written upside down into the margins. The entries themselves felt like a puzzle, trying to figure out the context of this girl's life, to recognize her handwriting, which was all in cursive, and mentioning people by names I couldn't recognize. The way that she wrote her eyes in a way that looked like "we" took on its own significance, as if I were already included as an onlooker to what happened in her house across 11 days. It was a bit perverse or voyeuristic to read this private account of her inner turmoil, of arguments and instances of domestic abuse. The entries themselves were all out of order, and so trying to make sense of who that he was as it would shift from entry to entry, seeming at one point like a father figure to a husband to a stepfather to a sibling, it's still unclear. I was completely derailed and taken in by trying to understand who this person was or is, and the more invested I got, the more confused I felt as to why I cared so much, why 150 pages into a very revered novel, I was more affected by 5 diary entries by some ageless, faceless author that I could never know more about, and why I was moved so quickly, brought to tears even in a coffee shop and staring at the floor, blinking, stunned. My mind started racing as soon as I read the last one to fill in the context and the gaps in the narrative, because it abruptly stops after them being slapped and locking themselves in a restroom. The irony is not lost on me that the book that these entries are in, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, is about a character written in the second person as you, the reader, who reads a book which suddenly stops and then follows that narrative trying to continue the book, which was a situation that I now found myself in. I could never find more information about this person. There was no name at the start to follow, and that itself gave the words a deeper significance. I read them over and over after I realized that they just stopped suddenly, as if by rereading it I could somehow understand it more and get blood from a stone. The fact that they were dated like diary entries made it feel more like I was invading something private. The expectation was that it wouldn't be read, or maybe it was the opposite. It was written in a book that was then sold, so if they sold it themselves, they would know that what they went through would be recognized by someone else, or maybe they weren't the one who sold it. The entries, I'm gonna wait for that. The entries talked about getting kicked out of their house, and so maybe this is just one of many leftover books that were sold with margins full of accounts of their life. Of their sister being yelled at for not filling a salt shaker, of him coming home drunk 2 hours late, of a pre-contextualized life that I was an unintended or maybe intended reader of that I can't make sense of. References to the picture in San Francisco of him saying he will fuck up my life the way I did his, or telling me that I'm not a virgin. They can be read as a drunk father figure of a controlling husband, but when they say this marriage is falling apart, who's involved in the this? I can't fully make sense of why this experience affected me so much. I've been questioning the line between reality and fiction, or performance and documenting. By implying an audience exists, does it change the text itself? That something, in this case a diary, is more significant because it was meant to be private, versus the book that it's written in can also be personal and sincere, but it's filtered through this lens of being constructed and public facing. What does an experience look like, what does an experience lose in being shared, / how does an aesthetic taint sincerity? Does my experience reading these change once I write this down, or when someone else overhears it? When does it warp? I wrote this on my own, but by reading it out loud it becomes something else, or is it something else once I start considering an audience in my writing? At the same time, what does an experience gain by being shared, by being offloaded? In a meta sense, isn't that the point of why I read books? And how is this different than something like autofiction or memoirs? Is it just that there being an intended audience works like an implied sense of consent? I was really unnerved and moved while reading this about this person's life, simultaneously feeling connected to and also aware that I won't ever understand who they are and that I can't know any more than I already do. I skipped context altogether and read these accounts of abuse, and it felt immediately intimate and also alienating to recognize the distance that existed between us and the fact that I could never really know anything. I'm still shaken up about it, but it felt really significant at the time, and I'm hoping that if I share a contextless experience, I can better understand something about myself, whether that be why I read or why I document so much. Although I understand that they're different, words can be truly contextless, but images less so, as they become the context themselves, even if they can lack meaning. there's a Susan Sontag thing about photography. At this point, I start going like off topic. The point being is that it really sparked my train of thought, and I was thinking really intensely for well over an hour. Yeah, kind of like the closing point is that I felt so much, you know, just from that, and I'm hoping slash wondering what happens if I try to pass that on. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know. It was just a really powerful experience, and I wanted to share it, I suppose. Let me know what you think, I guess. Or don't. I kind of feel like sharing it is enough. But I'm also, yeah, I don't know. That's all from me though.